Okay, then let's start. Welcome to this session of the Technical Steering Committee meeting. We want to discuss the proposal from Tim about exposing self-hosted shoots. There's this document here, a pull request for GEP-0036, not yet merged, but we will go over it and discuss it. So according to the general procedure, the agenda is as follows. We will have like 10 minutes for reiterating the core aspects of the proposal. And then 40 minutes split into 20-minute blocks for asking questions and challenging the document if needed. And finally, 10 minutes at the end to take a decision and come to a conclusion. Cool. Then Tim, please get started.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, for getting started, I would just share the proposed document again. As said, this is about the self-hosted shoot classes, so part of GEP-28. But because this particular aspect takes a bit more architectural design, we decided to open a dedicated enhancement proposal for it. Also because it includes a proposal for a new extension API. So in short, we want to make self-hosted shoot classes accessible, so meaning the API server. It should ideally be possible to configure it so that it behaves very similar to hosted shoot classes in this regard. So this is the main goal of this proposal. We want to enable external access. It's mainly about the managed infrastructure scenario, where this will definitely be simpler to implement, but we keep in mind that the mechanisms can be reused for the unmanaged infrastructure scenario as well. All of this is about the external domain, so the internal domain that is also available for hosted shoot classes is not relevant here. It's also outlined above. Yeah, we want to introduce a new extension resource to provide operators and developers with the needed flexibility. And with this, we can also support multiple exposure strategies. We will see two main categories of this in the document. And yeah, via the extension, we can implement provider-specific or custom logic for the goal of exposing the control planes. All starts with the shoot API. So let's go over this real quick. In the control plane section of a worker pool that can only be specified for self-hosted shoot classes, we propose to add a new exposure section. If it's not specified, Gardener does not care about exposing the cluster, but you can then select either the extension or the DNS strategy. And we will see both in detail. So for example, the extension strategy means that we want to create a self-hosted shoot exposure extension object. It looks pretty similar from the basic structure to the other extension objects. Garden ADM init will create it, and later on, once connected to a garden cluster, the gardenlet will update it, keep it up to date. And this object basically tells an extension to make sure that the control plane of the cluster can be accessed from the outside, whatever that means. And for this, we have the usual type provider config and secret, but also we specify all the endpoints that should be exposed, meaning all the control plane nodes should be listed here if they are healthy. So this endpoints list consists of node name, the addresses that is also part of the node status, but also the port on which the API server listens. As usual, we can wait for the last operation to be succeeded. But in addition, the extension will then expose the created ingress-like IP and host name so that the DNS record can be updated accordingly, just like for the hosted shoot clusters. Like for the other extension controllers, there will be support in the extensions library with a simple interface that extensions developers can implement. And yeah, that's basically it for the basic idea. There might be different implementations of this API. It could, for example, be a load balancer on a cloud provider that simply targets the listed endpoints. So very similar to the service controller of the Cloud Controller Manager. But it could also be another extension that makes use of software-defined load balancing, like with KubeVip or MetalLB, which potentially includes deploying some daemon sets or node per node components. But you can imagine anything really here in behind this API. For example, in provider local, we will probably do some hacks again, like some dummy load balancer services in the kind cluster. The other option, apart from the extension exposure, is using pure DNS, which basically means passing the control plane node endpoints straight to the DNS record. By this, we would not expose the cluster other than it is already exposed, so to say. So if the nodes only have internal IPs, that won't change. But if the nodes have external IPs, one could access the cluster from outside via the DNS record for simplicity. As we mainly target the managed infrastructure scenario, we also need to take care about updates to the control plane endpoints. So meaning support for rolling update of the control plane pool. So for this, there would be a new controller running in the gardenlet. So only when the cluster is connected to a garden, then this particular controller would watch the nodes of the control plane and update the self-hosted shoot exposure object accordingly, or the DNS record, depending on which is specified for this particular shoot. And that would be it for the core points of the proposal, I would say.
Cool. All right. According to the document, we also said that these 10 minutes should include the ask for a decision. So basically, I guess it's clear what the ask here is, since we already have this GEP document, so we can skip this part. The next 20 minutes would be for asking clarifying questions. Anything is still open and not yet explained?
I mean, I know you have for the load balancing part or for the non-DNS solution some solutions in mind. I'm just wondering, for usually if we do load balancing, also there is some possibility to configure health checks. Now in the current proposal, we just have basically the IP addresses and the port, meaning that you could only do the health check really on the traffic port. So you can't do something like take a node out of the load balancer backends for scheduled maintenance and stuff like that, because then you would, you can't distinguish between a node going or soon going down and actually being down, right?
True, that is not covered yet.
Is that something that, from your point of view, something that should be handled? Because I mean, if we consider ordinary load balancers that you have in managed infrastructures, you usually have these capabilities, but I'm not sure, for example, if you do an L2 magic thingy, if that's, I mean, there is no health check, right? Because then you do just ARP requests and you just propagate here, that's a node, and eventually a node will not be there yet anymore, and so on.
It depends on the implementation, I guess. I'm not too deep into kubevip, but I could imagine that it is more intelligent than just knowing there is a node and it should be exposed. But in the control plane exposure mode, it might be might have some more sophisticated checks, like actually probing the API server. But in the end, I'm not sure how you would implement a mechanism that proactively takes out a control plane out of the load balancing before running a maintenance operation. And I'm also not sure how you would do this with usual cloud provider load balancers. Because in normal load balancer services, you would have the health check port that is targets kubeproxy, which has the information about whether a node might be terminated by cluster autoscaler or something similar, right?
Maybe a node is not terminated, but even updated in place, and even for that you would want to temporarily remove it from the load balancing, right? And I guess
ideally we would, yes.
Yeah, and the usual strategy for doing so would probably include cordoning the node first. And this is something that we could detect in this controller and update them here in the endpoints. So remove the node that is cordoned to remove it from the load balancing. Maybe this would be something.
Yeah, it would basically it wouldn't introduce health checks, but it would be a more sophisticated logic for determining the health of the nodes before putting them in the endpoints list, right?
Okay, but that would then mean on the one side this draining logic needs to be handled, and then I think the cluster autoscaler tains to be deleted. That's also infamous, but yeah. So there are a couple of things that they might not be directly obvious here, but they might play a role later if you have a cluster and wonder why something changed, and in a short period of time during maintenance something is not working. But it's not, I mean, it doesn't contradict the proposal.
I guess that's something to keep in mind, and we can change the implementation later on to make it more stable or whatever, but it wouldn't need any changes to the proposed API.
Maybe we can still add it as I don't know, either future talk, but yes, yeah.
I will note it down and add it to the document. Are there other clarifying questions?
I'm not sure if you mentioned it in the beginning of today's session. So about the default domains. If you mentioned it, then I missed it maybe, but in the document at least I couldn't find it. So is there the idea to use any default domains that are configured in the system? Or would a shoot always need explicit DNS configuration if it should be exposed?
So the default domain is a mechanism that assigns an external domain when you create the shoot object on the API server, right? So once we have the shoot object, the spec always contains an external domain, meaning defaulting the domains would require a garden cluster before creating the shoot object, which is currently not something we do with Garden ADM. It might we might be able to create self-hosted shoot clusters from the garden cluster later on, but for now this was not in scope for GEP-28, correct?
No, but I mean, if you connect the shoot, then you have a gardener in all cases. So when the shoot is created for the first time in the gardener API, there is always a gardener system, obviously.
But when you connect the shoot already exists, so it already has a domain, correct?
Depends on what your local manifests contain. So it could or could not.
I assumed the domain was a required field. You can't omit it. It is required to get started
if this is the
Garden
case, then
ADM.
of course, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, because also Garden ADM and the components on the nodes themselves connect to the API server via this particular domain, because we always do this in the components, and we simply took this field as required for Garden ADM. We might make it optional later on, maybe, but for now it is required.
Okay. Yeah.
So in the scope of this this proposal, it's irrelevant, I guess.
Yeah.
Another clarifying question. I'm not sure anymore. I've read it 2 weeks ago, so maybe I missed it and don't remember anymore. Is this expected to be completely optional and changeable at any point in time, or is it basically something I need to create together with my self-hosted shoot cluster in the beginning? So another way, can I create a cluster and later change my mind and say now I need to expose it and create the self-hosted shoot exposure, and maybe then even later say, okay, now I don't need it, or switch from extension to DNS, or turn it out completely, turn it off completely again. Is that something you have in mind already, or are there limitations?
I didn't consider this yet. But I would assume that you can change the exposure strategy, because at the end, some value ends up in the DNS record object, and it is designed to be updated, right? It could change, like the load balancer address or whatever, I don't know. And we simply update the DNS record with it. So why not make it possible to change from the extension strategy to DNS? I don't see a reason for making it immutable. I'm not sure about the case of removing the exposure later on, because then we don't know what to do with the DNS record, right? We could simply destroy it, but it will probably be a disruptive operation for the cluster. Because not exposing the cluster is basically shifting the requirement of the exposure to the operator, or making their responsibility. So I would assume switching from extension to DNS or other way around would be possible, but disabling the exposure is probably not something we want to support out of the box.
And the other question was, do I need to have it in the beginning, or can I do it later?
You can do it later, I guess. So omitting it would disable the feature, and adding it later on should be possible.
Sorry, I didn't get it. Why is the removal a problem? So what is disruptive about it, except for it's no longer exposed? This I didn't get.
So at least in the managed infrastructure scenario, we heavily depend on Well, even in the other scenario, we generally depend on the domain name being available for connecting the worker nodes to the API server. So if we just destroy the DNS record object,
Okay. So without it, it's basically taking the IPs directly. Okay. Yeah, then it is of course
during
disruptive.
bootstrapping, at least, yeah. During Bootstrap, Garden ADM Bootstrap, it will just take the IPs to get the stuff running. But if you don't explicitly specify the exposure strategy, it would not update the DNS record anymore. It just gets the stuff up and running. But afterwards, it would be your responsibility to manage the DNS record. That's probably nothing you would do typically. You would generally use one of the possible exposure strategies. For the unmanaged infrastructure scenario, you will be responsible for managing the DNS record during bootstrapping yourself. And also later on, if you don't decide to make use of one of the strategies.
And how do you manage that? Sorry for this basic question, but how do you manage it if there is no DNS service? For example, let's say this, but you said this is a managed infrastructure. I'm just thinking out loud what happens if this runs without a complex infrastructure, basically on a few pieces of hardware. There is no DNS service, but the control plane, the machines there have, of course, IPs.
I think if you run in an unmanaged case, the assumption is on the lowest common denominator level, you have /etc/hosts.
Yes.
And you just put the names in there.
And why would the worker nodes not always use this mechanism? So what is the advantage of when using the exposure going over this, whatever, load balancer or DNS record?
The advantage
Load
is you
balancing.
can, for one, load balancing, and on the other hand, you can update it without touching the nodes, right? So if one control plane node dies and the previously exposed DNS record is outdated, you would need to go into all the nodes to update the IP, right?
Yes, when you, yeah. Also the initial point that Johannes brought up, so you would have to do it quite often if you're rolling the control plane node, and then you have to touch all the worker nodes, which sounds a little bit as it's rather impractical to not expose it at all.
Right. That's why I didn't even consider making it optional in the beginning. But Johannes pointed out that there might be some edge cases. And yeah, generally, if you know what you're doing and how to expose the DNS record, why not allow it? There might be options, I guess.
Thank you.
But for the DNS strategy, what would be in the values of the DNS record? The external IPs of the nodes, the control plane nodes, right?
If there are external IPs, yes. Otherwise, internal IPs or host names, depending on what is exposed in the node status.
And for the managed infra scenario, if we say we want to support removing this exposure section again, because maybe somebody changes their mind later on, they don't want this anymore, we could still keep the DNS record. And even if the control plane nodes have external IPs, we just point them to the internal IPs then. Wouldn't this be an option?
That's probably the best step you could take then. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's basically what happens during bootstrapping, right? So we just go back to this
Exactly, yeah.
Good point.
The custom resource or the new custom resource, that's just for the extension scenario, or
Yes.
so meaning if we do DNS, then we really specify everything here.
Correct.
Or is it automatic? So because in the custom resource we also have the node IPs. Would then the node IPs just be added here in the shoot spec, or?
No, not in the shoot spec, but they would end up in the DNS record object. So if you specify DNS, you first of all don't need to have an extension available that supports the this particular API. And the Gardenlet controller would then just update the values of the DNS record instead of updating the list of endpoints in this object.
Okay.
It will take the settings from spec DNS, right? So this DNS here is really an empty object, like in the example. There's not more information. Yeah.
We couldn't think of anything that you would need to specify here, but for keeping our options open, I guess, we will just specify an empty object. Maybe you want to specify a TTL or whatever later on.
Okay, yeah, sure. And for the provider local scenario, you didn't really go into the details here, how this might be done. But I was wondering whether we will do it with this cloud provider kind thing that we also looked at the last hackathon, or whether we should do it in the usual current way of hard coding some well-known ports here and there. Any ideas about that already?
I would definitely prefer the cloud provider kind, but the interface would be the same, or the implementation in the extension controller would be the same. We would create services of type load balancer in the kind cluster and point them to the correct control plane node. So by manually updating the endpoint slice object, and depending on which load balancer implementation we have available in the kind cluster at the time, we would use either the current hacky way or the better cloud provider way.
Okay, so you would try to get this in the upstream cloud provider kind, what we have developed in the last hackathon, and hopefully use it here. And if it's not accepted for whatever reason, then we use the usual way with provider local hacks.
Yes, I guess.
Okay.
It should be independent of this proposal.
Yes, it's independent. I was just wondering whether you see it as a task in the bigger list of implementation tasks to also get this cloud provider kind thing sorted, or whether you do it completely separate.
We have it on our list, but as an independent topic.
Okay, no. Yeah, I guess these 20 minutes are over, but that's the guideline. Of course, if you have more questions, feel free. Otherwise, the next 20 minutes would be for providing feedback, challenging the document, any discussions needed. So, any more questions to clarify the proposal?
Nope.
Nope.
Okay. Then maybe we can go to the feedback part. Anybody want to start?
From my point of view, the proposal looks good. It makes sense to introduce a new custom resource. for exposing the control planes, and it also offers various options with the DNS and alternative approaches. I think we can, as we've discussed on the GEP already, can reuse parts of it also for the unmanaged case with the DNS part, which is very nice. Yeah, for me, that's good.
Same. I read it before the meeting. Had even less questions than were raised here. It's good.
Yeah. I had one, if you maybe go to the future optimizations, one thought about this. So what was it again? Yeah, this thing where you talked about making it configurable, whether it's necessary to continuously update the list of endpoints or not. I was wondering whether we should just do it maybe right away, because generally the proposal or the whole work stream seems not to be too big. Maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, this is a small thing and maybe we could just do it right away as we are already on it. Any thoughts on that?
Why not? We can do it.
No. Okay. Then I think
would
in the
like
PR.
to-
Yeah.
I would like to bring up the one open question from the PR again,
Exactly,
which
yeah.
is about duplicating the list of, or the addresses of the nodes in the endpoints list. So one point was that the extension implementation could just query the list of nodes, filter it by the control plane labels, which would require additional permissions in the extension controller. But in the end, yeah, this might be negligible. Also, the network traffic that we incur might be, rather irrelevant. So these were just some thoughts. The current proposal makes it very simple to implement a given extension controller. But even if we don't duplicate the information right here, the implementation in the library could just implement the lookup of the node addresses. So even then, implementing such a controller is potentially very simple. Yeah.
The indirection may be of an advantage because of the topic you discussed in the beginning. Under which considerations, for example, draining, it should not be taken into account and it's decoupled.
Right. If we don't duplicate the information, we would duplicate the logic for excluding nodes from the load balancing. If we have the list of endpoints here, basically Gardenlet would have control over the filtering.
Usually we solve these things or such things with generic actuator concept in the extensions library. So some generic implementation that handles then the filtering, only ready nodes, for example, and then the concrete implementation can just use it and do the specific stuff on top. But yeah, I think for the DNS strategy, we need the Gardenlet controller anyways. And it's also slightly against the other extension APIs that we have, where the resource itself contains the necessary information that is needed for the reconciliation. So you usually don't look other stuff up when you reconcile an infrastructure or something, maybe.
Except for the cluster object.
Yeah, the cluster object with the shoot spec, the complete one maybe, but not something else. Yeah. So I would also have a slight preference to keep it here like it is proposed, and since we also, as said, have this garden.net controller anyways for the DNS, and it's very similar here.
One advantage of this option is that we have the explicit port field, which we do not have in the node status. So if we ever decide for whatever reason to expose the API server of self-hosted root classes on a different port, this might help in this transition.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. I was, like I mentioned in the comment, I was more, I don't know why, coming from the mindset that these IPs might change regularly and so on. Or what if these IPs change regularly? Then you have basically a controller having to keep that up to date all the time. But then again, I mean, if we assume, as we usually do, that our nodes are fairly stable and the IP address management doesn't really change the node IPs that much, then it's not really a duplication that harms you in any way. So it's completely fine.
Okay. Then we can keep it as proposed. Cool.
Yeah. If there is no feedback anymore, we can come to the last part, which is taking the decision to do it or not do it. I guess from the discussion, it's clear that we do it.
Yeah, I will
intervention.
I will update the proposal according to our discussion, but these were rather minor points.
Yes, so what I noted down is for the DNS strategy, we could describe this maintenance mode where cordoning nodes and marking them unschedulable might remove them from the endpoints list. And then the topic about, I wasn't sure whether you agreed with that, disabling the exposure and removing it completely is something we want to do or not do.
I would say we can do it. As for the other option, to completely disable the exposure from the beginning, it's probably not the usual case, but why not keep options open for some specific scenarios? So
yeah, if there is no technical issue that we could solve with that, or
yes,
blocks us in some way, we can just support it for now.
So if we disable the exposure later on, I noted down that we keep the DNS record, delete the extension object, but update the DNS record to point to the node IPs again, which was also used during Bootstrap.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, then we discussed this cloud provider kind topic. I will just mention it and link to the hackathon result maybe. Then the future optimization we want to do as, I don't know, just right now, not in the future, just do it as part of the implementation. And the last thing from the thing with the PR discussion with the querying nodes directly in the controller versus copying the endpoints, we also agreed on keeping it as it is. Okay. Anything I missed or I should write down additionally?
I also noted down that the default domains are irrelevant for this proposal, because it's a mechanism that only lives in the garden cluster, which we might not have from the beginning.
Because we need the DNS domain or DNS configuration right at the beginning, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Any final questions, feedback, thoughts, anything before we close the meeting?
Thank you for the proposal.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, cool. Then thanks for joining and have a nice afternoon.
Yeah.
See you next
You
time.
too.
You too.
Have a
Bye
nice
bye.
evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.